夢ならばどれほど良かったでしょう未だにあなた
into yarn and weave it. It's the chosen material for making these stencils. And if you notice here, the stencil is placed over this board, can puncture through the paper and go all the way through. And so you notice the tool that first and it gets wider and wider. So if you make a slight cut, you use the tip, but making it at the same time. The paper is stacked, and you notice that the paper is kind of a brown color. That's because it's treated with persimmon. Persimmon is a persimmon tannin from this persimmon fruit. It's one of the finest preservatives in the world, and the paper is treated with this, and it's aged for 3 years before the paper is made. You also see these white little marks here. That's made from paper. That's what is used to keep all 6 stencils straight and not shifting around, because if you're cutting through, you want each one to be exactly the same. And they've been doing this for 1,300 years. So it's been quite a bit of trial and error, and they realize that metal clamps are not nearly as effective as these paper clamps. So if you can, it takes 1 month to make a stencil. And it's important, you see the position of her cutter is perfectly perpendicular to the paper. If it's at an angle, the layers of stencil underneath will be cut in a different place, so they won't be exactly the same. So to make them all exactly the same, you have to go perpendicular. So she begins by making a tiny template, a tiny stencil, and that stencil will be repeated over and over and over again to make the big stencil. So it's a stencil to make a stencil. And これちょっといいですか？はい。ちょっと持ち上げてください。So you see this piece of paper. So she begins by cutting this piece of paper, and then she'll place this over the paper, and she'll rub it with a brush, and the brush has a kind of coloring in it. It's like a sumi ink, and that leaves the impression. So if you see here, some parts are cut and some places are black. So the black shows her where to cut. But there's something. This is precision at its height. So the bottom and the top have to match perfectly. And the reason for that is this stencil is only about 6 inches wide, and this is going to be placed on the silk. It's 40 feet long and 15 inches wide. And so it's placed 100 times, one after another. We'll get to see that. But where one stencil is placed, and then it's placed again, that place where it joins together, they have to match perfectly. So that means this part of the stencil and this part of the stencil have to match up. And if they don't match up, it won't look consistent. And the idea is, what you'll be seeing is everything is perfectly consistent, and you will never guess that it was made by a stencil. So 100 years ago, there were 1,000 people doing this work, and there are about 20 left. And there are 4 different kinds of stencil cutting in their trade. So we have 2 people doing 2 different kinds here. So in her particular kind, there are 2 people that are masters and 2 people who are learning. So it's compared to 1,000. It's really, it was on the brink of disappearing completely. But now we have these two young people who are studying, who have actually mastered it at this point. So we have great hopes for this craft.
So is this what is used for developing the patterns on kimonos?
Yes, we're going to see that right over
Okay.
here. Yes, exactly.
I was wondering what they do.
Yes, so this is for making kimono. And the kind of kimono it's called Edo Komon. And you can see this is an example of what she's carving now, what that will look like. So this, as I said, this takes 1 month to make the stencil.
これ掘り上がったやつもここに入ってます。
はい
それが。
Ah. So here's some finished stencils.
No, it's okay.
綺麗ですね。
Very,
砥石で研いで、研いで研いで、これになります。
and then it's by filing it down with a whetstone, she gets the shape. But the shape is very important.
で、まあ、折れて、
She will place it in this handle which she makes, bamboo handle.
Who makes the blades? Are they-
Applying, first of all, he applies a sticky rice powder and water to the board so that the silk will stay stationary on the board because you don't want it to move around when you're applying the paste. And the silk that's used is crepe silk. And crepe silk, chirimen crepe silk, is it has a slight texture in it, and it's one of the favorite kinds of silk used for stencil dyeing. There are hundreds of different kinds of silk in Japan. White silk for kimono, for all different processes. I think you're all familiar with satin, and satin is very shiny. It's shiny because some of the warp threads they expose them much longer than it would be for a plain weave. So you have a lot of shiny threads showing. This was a plain weave, but the reason why you get a texture is that the warp, which is the length of the loom, the long threads, are twisted fairly gently. If you decrease the number of twists, or if you increase the thickness of the thread, you'll have a different kind of weave, and it'll look different. So the number of a paste, and the paste is made of rice powder, rice bran, lime, and water. So this is not dye. What you're seeing here is not dye. It's resist. So filmmaking, exactly. So he's placing and there are markers, tiny dots within the design that he lines up with the stencil. So he finds that one dot that he knows on each side, and he lines it up with the stencil, and then he applies the paste. You can come closer. Please come closer. Step right up, step right up.
You called it a sumi paste, is that right?
It's a resist paste, and there's a tiny bit of sumi ink in it, just so he knows where he's,
It's a strong smell.
just to give it a little gray color. But it's not a dye.
You don't smell it. No. Oh, I do smell it now. Yeah.
So look at, can you see how it's perfect, that you cannot tell where one run was done and the
Yeah.
next one begins.
Awesome.
Do you notice that there are needles stuck on the edge of the stencil? Can you guess why?
Keep this with the correct position without moving.
Actually, it's not stuck into it, so it doesn't prevent it from moving. It does.
it
It's
to
not a
center?
prevent.
From curling, right?
It doesn't. It's not from
Doesn't do that.
curling.
Is it to center?
It's not to send. These are great answers, but the answer
Not
is
the right ones.
that it lifts. The edge of the stencil has no design in it,
Right.
and you don't want that to stick to the wet
Oh.
resist. So you lift it up, and that prevents it from smudging. Now,
It's amazing.
the paper is soaked in water for before he begins. It's soaked for an hour, and in order that the stencil itself relaxes, and when it's relaxed, you get the full design. Otherwise, if it shrinks, you don't get the full design. And also, it makes it softer and easy to apply. But that's the wonders of paper that's been soaked, that's been treated with persimmon. And it's the wonders of Japanese washi paper, which is such an extraordinary, really a textile and not paper. It's such a strong, durable, versatile, and sustainable piece.
Can he reuse this stencil?
So good question. So how many times can you use the stencil? So this will be used 100 times on this piece. So you've seen 3 out of 100. It takes a whole day, and then it's good for about 20 kimono, and then after that, it's probably around 20 starts to wear out, and then people have collections of used stencils and purchase them. They're not that expensive.
So is it instantly dried?
This takes a day to really dry, to fully dry. And so once this is dry, then he makes another paste. And the other paste has, again, rice bran, rice powder, lime, water, and he adds table salt. Color yourself, because there are about 2,000 shades in the whole spectrum. So the mixing of the color is very, very important. So you can see where he's pointing right now. That is his guide. That little dot there and that little dot there. And they use this kind of registration mark in many kinds of printmaking. It's fairly common, but this is one of the few where the registration mark isn't hidden. It's part of the design itself. Usually they hide. It's hidden someplace or removed. And it's the height of the
ということです。
So we're starting.